Abstract, we discuss the cognitive and the psychophysical determinants of choice in risky and riskless contexts. The psychophysics of value induce risk aversion in the domain of gains and risk-seeking in the domain of losses. The psychophysics of chance induce overweighting of sure things and of improbable events, relative to events of moderate probability. Decision problems can be described or framed in multiple ways that give rise to different preferences, contrary to the invariance criterion of rational choice. The process of mental accounting, in which people organize the outcomes of transactions, explains some anomalies of consumer behavior. In particular, the acceptability of an option can depend on whether a negative outcome is evaluated as a cost or as an uncompensated loss. The relation between decision values and experience values is discussed. Decision-making is shared by many disciplines. Addresses both normative and descriptive questions. The normative analysis is concerned with the nature of rationality and the logic of decision-making. The descriptive analysis is concerned with people's beliefs and preferences as they are, not as they should be. The tension between normative and descriptive considerations characterizes much of the study of judgment and choice. Analyses of decision-making distinguish risky and riskless choices. The example of decision under risk is the acceptability a gamble that yields monetary outcomes with specific probabilities. A typical riskless decision concerns the acceptability of a transaction in which a good or service is exchanged for money or labor. In the first part of this article we present an analysis of the cognitive and psychophysical factors that determine the value of risky prospects. In the second part we extend this analysis to transactions and trades. Risky choice attitudes toward risk and value. People are generally averse to risk and risk aversion decreases with increasing wealth. Sure gain is an instance of risk aversion. Preference for a sure outcome over a gamble that has higher or equal expectation is called risk averse. The rejection of a sure thing in favor of a gamble of lower or equal expectation is called risk seeking. Subjective value of a gamble is again a weighted average and weighted by its probability. Chance win 1000 is 85% weighted 85 100 plus 15 0 equals $850. To explain risk aversion within this framework, Bernoulli proposed that subjective value, or utility, is a concave function of money. Defined on gains and losses rather than on total wealth. Concave in the domain of gains and convex in the domain of losses. Considerably steeper for losses than for gains. Loss of $X is more aversive than a gain of $X is attractive. Framing of outcome. Risky prospects are characterized by their possible outcomes and by the probabilities of these outcomes. The same option, however, can be framed or described in different ways. Framing as a tool to demonstrate failures of invariance. Risk-averse in the lives saved version and risk-seeking in the lives lost version. The psychophysics of chances. Bernoullian expectation rule according to which the value, or utility of an uncertain prospect is obtained by adding the utilities of the possible outcomes, each weighted by its probability. To examine this assumption consult psychophysics intuitions. A change from impossibility to possibility or from possibility to certainty has a bigger impact than a comparable change in the middle of the scale. Figure 2 starting anywhere in the region of low probabilities, the impact on the decision weight of a reduction of probability from p to p/2 is considerably smaller than the effect of a reduction from p/2 to 0. Reducing the risk by half, then, is not worth half the premium. Figure 2 suggests that people greatly undervalue a reduction in the probability of a hazard in comparison to the complete elimination of that hazard. Formulation effects. The processes that control the framing of outcomes and events. The public health problem illustrates a formulation effect in which a change of wording from lives saved to lives lost induced a marked shift of preference from risk aversion to risk seeking. Transactions and trades. Analysis of framing and of value can be extended to choices between multi-attribute options, such as the acceptability of a transaction or a trade. We propose that, in order to evaluate a multi-attribute option, a person sets up a mental account that specifies the advantages and the disadvantages associated with the option, relative to a multi-attribute reference state. Losses and costs. Many decision problems take the form of a choice between retaining the status quo and accepting an alternative to it, which is advantageous in some respects and disadvantageous in others. Decision weights are lower than corresponding probabilities over most of the range. Underweighting of moderate and high probabilities relative to sure things contributes to risk aversion in gains by reducing the attractiveness of positive gambles. The same effect also contributes to risk-seeking in losses by attenuating the aversiveness of negative gambles. Low probabilities, however, are overweight, and very low probabilities are either overweight quite grossly or neglected altogether, making the decision weights highly unstable in that region. Concluding remarks. The concepts of utility and value are commonly used in two distinct senses. A. Experience value, the degree of pleasure or pain, satisfaction or anguish in the actual experience of an outcome. B. Decision value, the contribution of an anticipated outcome to the overall attractiveness or aversiveness of an option in a choice. The distinction is rarely explicit in decision theory because it is tacitly assumed that decision values and experience values coincide. This assumption is part of the conception of an idealized decision maker who is able to predict future experiences with perfect accuracy and evaluate options accordingly. For ordinary decision makers, however, the correspondence of decision values between experience values is far from perfect. March, 1978. Some factors that affect experience are not easily anticipated, and some factors that affect decisions do not have a comparable impact on the experience of outcomes. In contrast to the large amount of research on decision making, there has been relatively little systematic exploration of the psychophysics that relate hedonic experience to objective states. The most basic problem of hedonic psychophysics is the determination of the level of adaptation or aspiration that separates positive from negative outcomes. The hedonic reference point is largely determined by the objective status quo, but it is also affected by expectations and social comparisons. An objective improvement can be experienced as a loss, for example when an employee receives a smaller raise than everyone else in the office. The experience of pleasure or pain associated with a change of state is also critically dependent on the dynamics of hedonic adaptation. Brickman and Camels, 1971, concept of the hedonic treadmill suggests the radical hypothesis that rapid adaptation will cause the effects of any objective improvement to be short-lived. The complexity and subtlety of hedonic experience make it difficult for the decision maker to anticipate the actual experience that outcomes will produce. Many a person who ordered a meal when ravenously hungry has admitted to a big mistake when the fifth course arrived on the table. The common mismatch of decision values and experience values introduces an additional element of uncertainty in many decision problems. The prevalence of framing effects and violations of invariance further complicates the relation between decision values and experience values. The framing of outcomes often induces decision values that have no counterpart in actual experience. For example, the framing of outcomes of therapies for lung cancer in terms of mortality or survival is unlikely to affect experience, although it can have a pronounced influence on choice. In other cases, however, the framing of decisions affects not only decision but experience as well. For example, the framing of an expenditure as an uncompensated loss or as the price of insurance can probably influence the experience of that outcome. In such cases, the evaluation of outcomes in the context of decisions not only anticipates experience but also molds it.
Thanks for watching my presentation. Nahla Sulaiman Hussein.